Rugged mountain man Jedediah Walker expected to find a dying trapper inside a cursed, abandoned cabin after spotting a single wisp of smoke defying the howling blizzard of 1886. Instead, he discovered a terrified woman with a freezing heart, a loaded revolver, and a deadly secret poised to turn his quiet mountain sanctuary into a battlefield. The Wind River Range did not forgive, and it certainly did not forget. In the dead of January, the mountains of the Wyoming Territory were a jagged expanse of blinding white and deadly blue ice. The locals down in the valley called it the Great Die-Up, a winter so vicious that cattle froze standing up in the plains. Up at 8,000 feet, it was an entirely different kind of hell. Jedediah Walker was a man built from the very granite and pine of the peaks he called home. At 34, Jed had spent the last decade entirely removed from the complications of town society and the law. He traded his pelts twice a year in Lander, bought his coffee and flour, and vanished back into the timberline. With broad shoulders draped in a heavy buffalo hide coat, a thick, frost-tipped beard, and pale blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing, Jed was as much a part of the landscape as the wolves that trailed his hunting paths. It was a Tuesday afternoon, though days meant little when the sun barely breached the ridgeline. Jed was tracking a wounded bull elk through waist-deep drifts, leading his massive black draft-cross horse, Goliath, by the reins. The wind was picking up, threatening to erase the bloody trail, when Jed caught a scent that made him stop dead in his tracks. Wood smoke, faint, acrid, and struggling against the downdraft. Jed narrowed his eyes, squinting through the driving snow. A mile to the west sat dead wood draw a treacherous ravine that held nothing but the rotting remains of a trapper's shack. Old Man Abernathy had built it 20 years ago, but the roof had partially caved in under the snowpack of '79. No one in their right mind would seek shelter there. A seasoned man would know it was a death trap. The chimney was cracked, and the drafts would freeze a man long before the fire warmed him. Drawing his Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard, Jed left the elk trail and waded toward the draw. Outlaws sometimes pushed up into the mountains to hide from the marshals, and desperate men were the most dangerous kind of animals. As the ruined silhouette of the cabin came into view, Jed's instincts flared. There were no tracks outside, meaning whoever was in there had been holed up since before the storm began 3 days ago. The smoke coughing from the crumbling stone chimney was barely a wisp. The fire was dying, and whoever was tending it was likely dying with it. Jed tied Goliath to a sturdy spruce, thumbed back the hammer of his Winchester, and approached the door. It was hanging by a single leather hinge. He kicked it open with a heavy snowshoe. The sight inside made the hardened mountain man lower his rifle. Huddled in the corner, wrapped in a tattered, filth-covered wool blanket, was not a hardened outlaw or a lost gold prospector. It was a woman. She was violently shivering her lips a dangerous shade of blue, and her skin pale as porcelain. A meager fire of damp pine needles and broken chair legs smouldered weakly in the hearth, offering more blinding smoke than heat. Beside her lay an empty tin of beans and a frozen canteen. As Jed stepped into the dim, freezing cabin, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, desperate green. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the frostbite creeping into her cheeks, she didn't scream or beg for help. Instead, her trembling hands raised a silver-plated Colt .45, pointing it directly at Jed's chest. "Stay back," she croaked, her voice, barely a whisper, shredded by the cold and dehydration. Jed stood perfectly still, letting his rifle barrel rest toward the floorboards. He took in her appearance. Beneath the dirt and soot, her clothing was completely wrong for the frontier. She wore a tailored velvet riding habit, ruined and torn at the hem, and fine leather boots that offered absolutely no protection against the snow. This was a woman of wealth, a woman of the eastern cities, sitting in a ruined shack in the Rockies. "Mum," Jed said, his voice a deep, calming rumble. "If you pull that trigger, you might hit me, but the recoil is going to break your frozen wrist and you'll freeze to death in this shack before sundown. Let me help you." I said, "Stay back," she repeated, but the revolver began to dip. Her eyes rolled back, the last of her adrenaline leaving her body. The gun slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the freezing dirt floor as she slumped sideways. Jed closed the distance in 2 strides. He stripped off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it entirely around her fragile frame. She was terrifyingly light, her body consumed by the cold. Without a second thought, Jed scooped her into his arms, grabbed the silver Colt, and shoved it into his belt, and kicked his way back out into the blizzard. He secured her sideways in Goliath's saddle, holding her upright with one massive arm, while he grabbed the reins with the other. "Hold on, little lady," Jed muttered, his jaw set against the biting wind. "You ain't dying on my mountain today." The trek to Jed's cabin took 2 grueling hours, fighting against a whiteout that threatened to disorient even him. But Jed's cabin was a fortress, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, caulked with river mud, and nestled against a rock face that blocked the worst of the northern gales. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind him, instantly cutting off the roar of the blizzard. The cabin was a sanctuary of warmth, smelling of cured leather, dried herbs, and burning hickory. Jed worked with mechanical efficiency. He laid her on the thick, bearskin rug in front of the massive stone hearth and built the fire up until it roared, casting flickering golden light across the room. He carefully peeled away her frozen outer layers, wincing at the ice crystals that clung to her fine silk blouse. He rubbed her hands gently with a lukewarm towel, avoiding the temptation to use hot water, which would shock her system. For the first time in the warm glow of the fire, Jed truly looked at her. Her hair, freed from a tight, frozen bun, cascaded over her shoulders in rich waves of auburn. She possessed a refined, striking beauty that felt entirely alien in Jed's rugged world. But it was the dark, bruised circles under her eyes and the raw blisters on her heels that told a story of a desperate, relentless flight. It took nearly 3 hours for the color to begin creeping back into her cheeks. Jed was sitting by the fire, slowly stirring a pot of venison stew, when he heard a sharp gasp. He turned to see her sitting bolt upright, frantically patting her sides. "Where is it?" She panicked, her green eyes wide with terror as she scanned the unfamiliar room. "My gun, my bag, where are they?" "Easy there," Jed said, keeping his voice soft, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. My name is Jedediah Walker. You're in my cabin about 5 miles up from where I found you. Your gun is on the table over there unloaded." She stared at him, breathing heavily, trying to process the towering, bearded man and the sudden, intense warmth. Her gaze darted to the table, confirming the presence of her belongings. She pulled the thick wool blankets tighter around her shoulders. I am Clara," she said softly, her guard still up. She didn't offer a last name. "Well, Clara," Jed said, ladling a generous portion of steaming stew into a tin bowl. "You were about 2 hours away from becoming a permanent fixture in Abernathy's old shack. You mind telling me what a city woman is doing, trying to winter out in the Wind River Range?" Clara accepted the bowl with trembling hands, the warmth of the tin practically making her whimper in relief. She took a slow, agonizing sip of the rich broth. "I got lost," she lied smoothly, though she avoided his gaze. "My stagecoach was caught in a drift down in the valley. I wandered off looking for help." Jed leaned back in his wooden chair, taking a slow sip from his coffee mug. "That's a remarkable story, Clara. Truly, especially considering the nearest stage route is 40 miles south, and the snow up in that drawer hasn't been disturbed by anything but a mountain lion in 3 weeks. Clara stopped eating, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the spoon. "I'm not a lawman," Jed continued gently. "I don't care what you did. But if there are men coming up this mountain after you, I need to know. A storm this bad keeps most men in the saloons, but a desperate man will walk through hell to get what he wants." "No one is coming," Clara said firmly, though a slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I'm just a woman who made a terrible mistake in her travels. I will pay you for your hospitality as soon as the weather clears, Mr. Walker." Jed nodded slowly. He wasn't going to push her. The wilderness had taught him patience above all else. "Eat your stew, Clara. You can sleep in the bed tonight. I'll take the rug by the fire." Over the next 2 days, the blizzard raged on, trapping them in the small cabin. A strange, quiet domesticity fell over them. Jed chopped wood in the attached lean-to and tended to his gear, while Clara, recovering her strength, insisted on helping by mending some of Jed's torn flannel shirts with a surprisingly skilled hand. Despite her tough exterior, Jed noticed the small things. The way she jumped at the sound of a heavy branch snapping outside. The way she always kept her back to a solid wall. And the way she stared into the flames at night, a profound sadness etched into her features. For Jed, a man who had chosen a life of isolation because he found the world of men to be cruel and empty, Clara was a puzzle he found himself wanting to solve. He found his eyes lingering on her when she wasn't looking captivated by her fierce will to survive. On the 3rd night, the twist of fate finally revealed itself. Clara was asleep in the bed, breathing softly. Jed was up late, applying bear grease to his leather boots near the fire. Clara's heavy, ruined velvet coat had been hung near the hearth to dry out completely. As Jed shifted his elbow, knocked the coat off its peg. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, unnatural thud. Jed frowned. He knelt and picked up the coat. The lining was torn, revealing a hidden sewn-in pocket. The seams had burst from the impact. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger, tightly wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Curiosity overcoming his manners, Jed slid the ledger out and opened it to the first page. His blood ran cold. The neat, harsh handwriting at the top of the page read, "Property of Harrison Caldwell, Caldwell Mining Syndicate, Boston and Cheyenne." Jed knew that name. Everyone in the Wyoming Territory knew that name. Harrison Caldwell was a ruthless, bloodthirsty tycoon who had spent the last 5 years violently driving independent ranchers and miners off their land. He owned politicians, judges, and a private army of hired guns. Jed flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a ledger of accounts. It was a ledger of crimes. Dates, names, and exact sums paid for arson, bribery, and murder. It was a map of Caldwell's entire corrupt empire. It was enough evidence to hang the most powerful man in the West. A floorboard creaked behind him. Jed turned to see Clara standing near the bed. She was no longer the fragile, shivering woman he had found in the snow. She stood straight, her jaw set, and the silver Colt was once again gripped firmly in her hand, pointed right at him. "I told you I wasn't followed, Jedediah," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. "But if you hand that ledger over to the authorities in Lander, Harrison Caldwell will burn this entire mountain range to ash to find me." Jed looked from the gun to the ledger and then up to her desperate green eyes. The woman living alone in the snow cabin wasn't just lost. She had stolen the devil's playbook, and the devil was surely on his way. "Put the gun down, Clara," Jed said slowly, standing up, tossing the ledger onto the table. I told you I ain't a lawman." He took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "But I'll be damned if I let Harrison Caldwell's filth touch my mountain. Now tell me the truth. Who are you to him?" Clara's hands lowered an inch, a tear finally escaping and cutting a path down her cheek. "I'm his fiancée," she whispered into the quiet cabin, "and I'm the one who stole everything from him." The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 4th day. The howling wind was replaced by a silence so profound it made the ears ring. Outside, the Wind River Range was buried under 5 feet of flawless, blinding white snow, glittering under a searing blue sky. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to cut with a skinning knife. Jedediah stood by the frosted window, wiping away a circle of condensation with his thumb to survey the tree line. Clara sat at the heavy oak table, the damning ledger resting between her hands, like a lit stick of dynamite. The silver colt was holstered at her hip, secured by a makeshift rig, fashioned from one of Jed's spare saddle strings. "My maiden name is Montgomery," Clara said quietly. Her voice was steady now, entirely stripped of the shivering fear from days prior. "My father was Arthur Montgomery. He ran 1,000 head of cattle down in the Sweetwater Basin." Jed didn't turn from the window, but his broad shoulders stiffened. "I remember the Montgomery outfit. Good beef, fair men. I heard your father died of a sudden fever 3 years back." "A fever of lead," Clara replied bitterly. "Harrison Caldwell wanted our water rights. When my father refused to sell Caldwell's hired guns, ambushed him on the trail to Casper. The local sheriff ruled it a robbery gone wrong, but everyone knew the truth. Caldwell swooped in, bought the foreclosed land for pennies from a bank he owned, and left me with absolutely nothing." Jed finally turned his pale blue eyes, resting on her. "So you didn't just steal from him. You conned a killer." "I moved to Boston," Clara explained, her green eyes flashing with a hard, brilliant fire. "I learned how to dress, how to speak, how to play the part of a wealthy shipping heiress. I returned west, attended the governor's gala in Cheyenne, and made sure Caldwell noticed me. It took a year to get a proposal out of him. It took another 6 months to find where he hid that ledger. I didn't want his money, Jedediah. I wanted his neck in a noose. That book contains the bribes he paid to federal judges, the bounties on independent ranchers, everything." Jed looked at the refined woman sitting in his wilderness cabin. The sheer grit it took to sleep next to the man who murdered her father, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, commanded a profound, silent respect from the hardened mountain man. Before Clara could say another word, Goliath, the massive draft horse secured in the attached lean-to, let out a sharp, panicked whinny. He stamped his heavy hooves violently against the frozen dirt floor. Jed's faint smile vanished instantly. He grabbed his Winchester 1873 from the mantel and racked the lever. The metallic clack-clack echoed loudly in the small room. "Someone's out there," Jed muttered, moving swiftly to the heavy oak door. He dropped a thick iron bar into the wall brackets with a solid thud. "Goliath doesn't spook for deer, and the bears are asleep." Clara stood up, her hand instinctively dropping to her Colt. "Keep away from the glass," Jed ordered, pressing his eye to a narrow, slotted gun port he had carved into the timber frame. Through the slit, Jed scanned the blinding expanse of the timberline. A shadow detached itself from the pines. Then another. 5 men mounted on thick-coated winter horses were struggling through the chest-deep drifts. Leading the pack was a man wearing a distinctive flat-brimmed hat. Jed recognized him immediately, Dutch Calloway Caldwell's chief enforcer. "Hello, the cabin." Dutch's voice boomed across the snowy clearing. "We know you're in there, Miss Clara, and whoever you got hiding you best toss her out. Mr. Caldwell just wants his property back. Give us the girl and the book and we ride away." Jed looked at Clara. Her face was pale, but she shook her head resolutely. "I'd rather burn." "I ain't much for fire," Jed replied. He stepped back from the door, knelt by the hearth, and pulled away the thick, bear-skin rug. Beneath it lay a heavy iron ring set into the floorboards. He heaved it up, exposing a dark, narrow root cellar. "This tunnel dumps out into a ravine 30 yards behind the cabin. I'm going out to flank them. When I start shooting, they're going to panic. If any of them make a run for the door, you shoot right through the wood. Understand?" Clara grabbed his arm. "Jedediah, they'll kill you." Jed reached up his rough thumb, gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from her cheek. "It's my mountain, Clara. They're just trespassing." Jed slipped into the dark tunnel, Winchester in hand. Outside, Dutch Calloway lost his patience. "Light it up!" Dutch barked. A deafening volley of rifle fire erupted. Bullets thudded harmlessly into the 2-foot-thick pine logs of the cabin. Clara ducked, covering her ears, then raised her Colt, aiming squarely at the heavy door. Meanwhile, Jed emerged from the snow-covered ravine like a phantom. His white thermal shirt and snow-dusted trousers camouflaged him perfectly against the drifts. He circled behind the posse, raised his Winchester, and fired. Crack! The bullet smashed into the nearest rider's saddle horn, sending sharp splinters flying. The horse bucked violently, tossing the man into the deep snow. "Ambush!" Dutch roared, spinning his mount. "Into the trees!" But the deep powder trapped them. Jed worked the lever with terrifying speed. He shot the rifle directly out of the second man's hands. He put a bullet clean through the canteen of the third. Panic set in among the hired guns. Spotting the muzzle flash, Dutch dismounted, using his thrashing horse as cover, and aimed his scoped rifle at the trees. Before he could pull the trigger, the cabin door swung wide open. Clara stood in the doorway, her silver Colt raised with both hands. She squeezed the trigger. The heavy .45 caliber bullet tore through the crisp air and struck Dutch in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the snowbank. His rifle clattered away. Silence slammed back down on the mountain. Jed stepped out from the tree line, his rifle leveled. "Throw the guns out where I can see them," he bellowed. One by one, the terrified men tossed their weapons into the drifts. Jed trudged forward, hauled a bleeding Dutch Calloway to his feet by his lapels, and pressed the hot rifle barrel directly under his chin. "Tell Harrison Caldwell the ledger is gone," Jed growled, his pale eyes burning. "And if he ever sends men up this mountain again, I won't just shoot their saddles. Now get your boys on their horses and ride." The journey down the mountain took 2 grueling days. With the hired guns sent packing, Jed and Clara knew Caldwell would not stop. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The only way to survive was to sever the head of the snake. They didn't ride for the local sheriff in Lander. Caldwell owned him. Instead, they rode straight for Cheyenne, to the territorial capital. The city of Cheyenne was a bustling hub of rail lines, cattle money and political corruption, but it was also home to a man whose reputation was as unyielding as iron. Jed had heard the stories down in the trading posts. The famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency had recently dispatched one of their most legendary operatives, Charlie Siringo, to investigate the rampant range wars tearing the Wyoming Territory apart. Siringo was a former cowboy-turned-detective, a man who couldn't be bought, bullied, or intimidated. It was late evening when Jed and Clara walked into the territorial marshal's office. The room smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool. Sitting behind a cluttered desk, wearing a rumpled suit and a quiet, calculating expression, was Charlie Siringo. The detective looked up as the towering mountain man and the battered but defiant woman entered. "Office is closed, folks," Siringo said, leaning back in his chair. Clara walked straight to the desk and dropped the heavy oilcloth-wrapped ledger onto the wood with a loud smack. "My name is Clara Montgomery," she said clearly, "and this is the rope that will hang Harrison Caldwell." Siringo's eyebrows shot up. He slowly leaned forward, unwrapped the oilcloth, and opened the book. As his eyes scanned the meticulous columns of bribes, hits, and stolen land deeds, a slow, dangerous smile spread across the Pinkerton detective's face. "Miss Montgomery," Siringo said, looking up with genuine awe. "The agency has been trying to find a crack in Caldwell's armor for 3 years. You didn't just find a crack. You brought me the whole damn forge." "Will it be enough to arrest him?" Jed asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Siringo closed the book. "With this, I won't just arrest him. I'm going to freeze every bank account, seize every deed, and have a federal marshal drag him out of his mansion in irons before sunrise. Caldwell is finished." The relief that washed over Clara was absolute. The rigid posture she had maintained for over a year finally crumbled. She swayed slightly, and Jed was immediately there, his strong arm catching her waist, supporting her. "You did it, Clara," Jed whispered. "It's over." 3 weeks later, the Wyoming Territory was turned upside down. Harrison Caldwell was arrested by federal marshals, his empire dismantled overnight by Siringo and the territorial judges. The stolen lands were tied up in court, but Clara's family ranch was slated to be returned to her name. She was standing on the platform of the Cheyenne train depot, wearing a clean, simple woolen dress. The winter air was still biting, but the sun was warm. Jedediah stood beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable in the bustling city environment. He had his heavy buffalo coat on Goliath, saddled and waiting near the hitching post. "The train leaves for Boston in an hour," Clara said, looking down at her gloved hands. "I have an aunt there. I suppose I'll stay with her until the courts sort out the deed to the Sweetwater Ranch." Jed nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Boston? That's a long way from the Wind River." "It is," Clara replied softly. She looked up, her green eyes locking onto his. The fierce, desperate woman he had found in the snow was gone, replaced by a woman who had faced her demons and won. But the sadness had returned to her gaze. "It's going to be awfully quiet in the city, Jedediah. Not nearly enough pine trees." Jed looked at the train, then down at the woman who had brought a fire to his isolated world that he didn't know he was missing. He had spent 10 years hiding on a mountain, convincing himself that he didn't need the world of people. But as he looked at Clara, he realized the mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It was just an empty cabin. "Sweetwater Basin is good country," Jed said slowly, a rough edge to his voice. "Good grass for cattle. Hard work, though. A woman running a ranch like that could probably use a foreman. Someone who knows how to shoot, how to build, how to survive." Clara's breath hitched. A brilliant, stunning smile broke across her face, lighting up her eyes. "I believe she could," Clara whispered, stepping closer to him, her hands resting against the thick lapels of his coat. "Are you applying for the job, Mr. Walker?" Jed reached down, his calloused hands gently holding hers. "I'm applying for a permanent position, Miss Montgomery." The train to Boston blew its whistle steam, billowing into the winter sky, but neither of them paid it any mind. The blizzard had brought them together in the frozen dark, but as they walked away from the station, back toward the rugged frontier, they walked into the warmth of a new sunrise. The thrilling stories of the Wild West, if Jed and Clara's fight for justice, and their incredible wilderness romance kept you on the edge of your seat. Hit that like button. Share this incredible true-to-life frontier tale with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking, action-packed stories from the untamed edges of history. Drop a comment below. Would you have braved the blizzard to save a stranger? See you next time.